So just to give you a little bit more background about Judy, I wanted to let you know that she actually lived in Mombasa for about 22 years. And in 2004, she returned to the UK and she lives in Kent. As you can see her in her cottage. She's written widely on coastal history, art, and architecture, and was very intensely involved in the conservation program for the Old Town in Mombasa. And so in 1988, she received her MLit for her thesis on the carved wooden doors of the East African coast. And she's going to talk to us about some of that today. She's written 4 historical biographies set in East Africa. So some of which you can still get on Amazon, but some of which are out of print, but she'll tell us a bit more about that. She's currently on the advisory committee for the Swahili Heritage Trust and is a frequent contributor to Old Africa magazine, where she publishes stories and photos from East Africa's past. Some of you may have attended a project that she was involved in, the Gujarati Yatra project in 2007. And she lent some of her own items for the exhibition in Croydon and gave a talk on the linkage between the doors, plates and kangas and their influence in Gujarat. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a backdrop to our speaker, Judy, which I want to welcome you to our virtual stage. Over to you, Judy. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Shahina, for giving me a nice intro. And thank you to ITREB for inviting me to your heritage talks. And I would like to extend a personal thank you to Mahana Kashabji. And today I'm going to talk to you about my own personal journey of research and how it led me to investigate the Indian communities living at the coast of East Africa, and then later into some quite intensive research into the beginnings of Ismaili settlement. You all know the old adage, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing, and that saying is, I think, particularly relevant today, with so much fake news floating around on the internet and social media. So it is with caution that I approach this topic and hope that, not having an Islamic background, what I have to say will not cause you any offense. And I apologize in advance if I do so inadvertently, as it is certainly not my intention. I arrived in Mombasa early in 1982 at the age of 34. My husband worked for a ships agency company and was unexpectedly transferred from Japan, where we had been based for 7 years. He was an ex-merchant seaman who had received his training with the British India Steamship Navigation Company, known as BI for short, rising to the rank of captain, but had left the sea and taken a shore job after marriage. He knew the area well, the region of East Africa well, but for me, it was a completely new adventure. On arrival, I was surprised to see how many of the traders and businessmen in Mombasa were Indians, or Asians, as they are confusingly called in East Africa. Many of his staff were Indian. All the accounts, the boarding officers, his second in command, and his lovely secretary, who was so kind to me, showing me the ropes in a strange and new country. Also, the shopkeepers and tradesmen all seemed to be Indian. That has now changed, but that was how it was in the 1980s. Who were they all? What part of India had they come from, and why were so many working and living in this part of Africa? These questions led me on a long and fascinating journey of research. When I started, there was little interest in the history of Asian settlement in East Africa, either from the people themselves or the academic world. Anything that looked vaguely Islamic was labeled Arab, while in a post-colonial era, the input of African culture was being stressed. The contribution from India was thought to be negligible and limited to commercial activity. However, the deeper I delved, the more the Indian connection came up. With time on my hands and no chance of a paid job, I met Rosemary MacDonald, who had studied the same subject at university as me, history of art. She introduced me to her friends, who had started a historical society in Mombasa and were trying to encourage awareness of the cultural heritage of the coast. They were concerned that with rapid development, many of the historic buildings, carved wooden doors, and unique character of the town was disappearing. I began to work with them, collecting historical information, photographing buildings and doors as an archival record. I loved doing it. I had worked at the National Maritime Museum before marriage, so this was an area where I felt I could contribute and be useful. The name of our society was Friends of Fort Jesus. Next. This shows, this is a painting in the 1920s of the Portuguese fort called Fort Jesus, which is the most famous landmark in Mombasa. It was built in the late 16th century and is now a museum, and it overlooks the old Dhow harbour and old town of Mombasa. I chose this depiction because it shows a Bagala dhow at anchorage. These ships used to be the workhorses of the Indian Ocean before the age of steam. They were the largest and the grandest of dhows and were capable of carrying heavy loads. They were built in Surat, Manvi, and Bombay, and as you can see, borrowed elements of Western ship design. And they also were decorated with beautiful carving work that has a lot of comparisons with the carving work on the carved doors of the towns. The founders of Friends of Fort Jesus moved away in 1983, and Rosemary and I were left to carry on the work. We produced a guidebook to Mombasa Old Town in 1985. This went into a number of editions and was my first experience of writing a book. Rosemary left as well that year, but I carried on, continuing to record the carved doors and make an inventory of all the old buildings in the town and create with Maurice Taff a photographic collection for the museum. In 1988, I received an MLit degree from Durham University for my thesis on the carved doors of Mombasa and the East African coast. Next. This is just showing the Old Town guide, which unfortunately is now out of print, and also a booklet, which was based just a sort of shortened version of my thesis, which is unfortunately also now out of print as well. I would spend nearly every morning walking in the old town, talking to the people and gathering information. I discovered that many of the carved doors fronted Indian businesses and shops, and I was able to identify different styles of door. Particularly prominent in Mombasa was a style I labelled Gujarati, because the owners nearly always originated from Gujarat and Kutch. Next. This shows a particularly fine door, Gujarati door, which once belonged to Aladina Visram, who was a prominent Ismaili merchant who moved to Mombasa from Bagamoyo in 1899, and this was the door to his main office. I gradually came to realise that the early doors and even the windows were generally made by Indians and often came direct from India, imported by Dhow, like an IKEA flat pack. The Gujarati doors in particular have a clever means of construction slotting together in a stable and durable way. When photographing doors in Zanzibar in 1986, amongst the rubble of collapsed houses and general decay, I was surprised to see doors still standing, determined survivors from more affluent times. The present day reconstruction and restoration of Zanzibar has been a truly wonderful operation, and much of it is due to the generosity of the Aga Khan-led initiatives. My friend Rosemary was one of those who worked on the original recovery plan with Francesco Siravo. The UNESCO attempts to conserve the old towns of Lamu and Mombasa have sadly not been quite as successful. So next slide, please. This diagram shows you how the Gujarati doors were constructed. You can see that they were designed to be strong and secure, with coffering on the door panels and heavy locks and a center post covering the join. The fine carving work was reminiscent of Persian or Mughal designs. Next, please. This engraving, which dates from 1872, shows the British consulate in Zanzibar. I include it because it is known that the upper windows and the door was sent from Bombay in the late 1840s, as the British consul wrote to the government in Bombay requesting them, as windows and doors were not available in Zanzibar at that time. Certainly windows with glass panels that could be opened and shut were unknown, and the windows of that time were simple openings furnished with iron bars. The historic towns of Mombasa and Zanzibar show a great deal of Indian influence. Not only did the commercial activity of the Indian merchants do much to create wealth, but the physical construction of the town was also largely the work of Indian builders and carpenters. Indian masons and engineers designed and built the fine houses and palaces for the sultans and rich Arabs. In the colonial era, the practice continued as Indian builders continued to be responsible for much of the construction work. In Kenya, the railway was built by Indian laborers. Wrought ironwork was brought from India and later made by Indian artisans in the railway workshop, along with skilled joinery work. Many Indian building contractors still live in Kenya, and owners of hardware stores and builders, merchants, tend to be of Indian heritage. Nowadays, there are many African builders and carpenters, but an underlying influence from India lingers on. Back in Mombasa, I met up with Cynthia Salvadori. Next. Here is Cynthia in Lamu, in a typical pose. She had just produced her seminal work, Through Open Doors, which explores the many different religions and communities of Indians living in Kenya. And she was now beginning to collect stories for her mammoth 9-year undertaking entitled We Came in Dhows. This eventually came out in 3 volumes and told the stories of Indian settlers in their own words. This was a wake-up call to the communities, Indian communities of East Africa, who began to realize how important it was to record their own history before memories were lost. As an anthropologist, her approach was different to mine, and I learned a lot from her. It was an eye-opener to learn about the many distinct communities and listen to their fascinating background stories. Cynthia would stay with me whenever she came to the coast, and I would travel with her, meeting the families while she took notes and asked questions. Cynthia was a remarkable person and very good at making a friendly, relaxing atmosphere. She had a slight speech impediment, a stammer, and dressed in a very ordinary way, so that I think put people at their ease. She was never in a hurry and made friends with her interviewees, returning to see them again and again. It was a way that was successful in Kenya at that time, but today would be more difficult. People have become more hectic and closed in with less face-to-face contact. We had great adventures together, and of course showing interest in their stories was flattering, as most people at that time were not interested. We were a bit different, so I think that piqued curiosity as well. Cynthia had her little black notebook where she jotted down a few facts. Once back home, she transferred it all to her computer, gaps and inconsistencies noted. Often I would then be asked to go back and check again in order to get it right. It was always pleasurable doing fieldwork research in Mombasa and the coast, as people were so friendly and had a leisurely approach to life. In the old town in the 1980s, doors were left open in the shops and businesses, and the first introductions were often made there. People lingered in the street, bought from street vendors, and were happy to stop and chat. Then often they would invite you for a cup of coffee or to a meal in their home when they got to know you. Both Cynthia and I used to walk about Mombasa a great deal and became familiar figures. It was easy socializing, and interviewing was done bit by bit. Often a little more came to light only after several visits when trust had been created. One of the most rewarding projects I was involved with was the book Two Indian Travelers. Next, please. This consisted of 2 texts translated from the Gujarati and then annotated by myself and Cynthia. Sharifa Keshavji did the wonderful translations. The first section of the book contains the account of a young Bohora ivory trader from Mombasa who travelled up to Uganda by rail to confront and recoup losses from Baluchi hunters who had failed to repay their loan or remit ivory as agreed. He managed to do this and saved the family from bankruptcy. This was a very rare find, as virtually no personal accounts written by Indian merchants exist, certainly dating as early as 1902 to 4. It was written by hand in a ledger by Ebramji Norbai Adamji, who is the man on the left that you can see there. He was one of the first pupils to attend the Buxton School in Mombasa, run by Christian missionaries, where he learnt to read and write English. And in writing a journal, he was probably influenced by his British teachers. I learned a bit while chatting to Ebramji's youngest son, Abdul Hussain, who had a business in the old town. He also had photographs and written letters of recommendation belonging to his family. They were a very old Mombasa family who had settled long before the British arrived in circa 1835 and originated from Kutch, Manvi. It was a unique find which involved a great deal of friendly and determined spade work before Abdi finally agreed to release his precious family documents to us. The other text was written by a Parsi living in Zanzibar. He is the other person portrayed here on the right. He lists a number of Ismaili subscribers at the front of his book, which was dedicated to Al-Din of Islam and described the opportunities to be found in British East Africa. It was a rare book, specifically written to encourage settlement from India, and one of the only known copies was held by his granddaughter living in Nairobi. For present-day Ismailis interested in researching their ancestors, this is a good source, as Zanzibar was the first point of entry for most early Ismaili settlers. 10 years ago, another interesting project came my way. A request to write a biography of an Ismaili called Piraduji, who lived 1840 to 1904. Next slide, please. Here he is. This is the only known portrait that we managed to find, and it's probably actually a passport photo. This called for research on an altogether different level, as virtually nothing had been written about Indian settlement from that early period. Early settlers had put all their energies into working hard and putting food on the table, and had little time or inclination for anything else. The Muslim communities may have had an additional reason, as conversion to Islam was often a means to reinvent themselves. Some started new dynasties when they arrived in East Africa, dropping or even changing their names. They were self-made men and proud of it, looking to the future and not to the past. This lack of interest in family history has changed, as nowadays a new generation are interested in knowing who their ancestors were and where they came from. For me, the lack of easily available information made this a very challenging project indeed. But Piraduji was already a familiar name to me, an old acquaintance who I first met on the back of a plate. In Mombasa, I used to enjoy browsing in the antique shops of Old Town, and amongst the bric-a-brac, there were always piles of brightly painted bowls or plates. These usually had a European pottery mark on the back, stamped on the base, but a few had the name Piraduji, Zanzibar. I became fascinated by these decorative plates and wrote an article about them for the Kenya Museum magazine, Kenya Past and Present. And then later on, I have written other articles as well. Next, please. Here is a typical plate. And in fact, it probably shows a clove bud, which would have been very attractive for the Zanzibari people. And with the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869, trade between Europe and East Africa boomed. Industrialization and advances in technology meant that items such as ceramics and printed cottons could be mass-produced at cheap prices, undercutting the producers, the traditional producers, who came from India and the Far East. However, old trade patterns did return once technology caught up. So, next slide, please. This shows the pottery marks that you can find stamped on the back of these old plates. And the top one in the left-hand corner shows Piraduji, Zanzibar. And at the bottom, on the left, is the mark of Abdul Hussein Bros, which were Pieradugi's sons, who also had a company. And just above that, you can see the German East Africa Company, the mark for the East Africa Gesellschaft, which is the East African, German East Africa Company. And at the top of at the right is the mark of the Sphinx mark of Petrus Regu, Maastricht. And this is one of the most commonly found marks, and they still produce pottery to this day, I believe. Anyhow, imagine my surprise when nearly 20 years later, I received an email from a Hussein and Audrey Dugee, who had seen my original article. They said they were descendants of Pieradugi and wanted someone to write his life story, as Piera in the era of the Sultans had been an influential and important man. Hussein and Audrey had been researching the life of their ancestor for a number of years and had come across snippets of tantalizing information. Now they were looking for someone to pull it all together, and they thought I was the right person to do it. Somewhat rashly, I agreed. There were large parts in Piera's life which were missing and needed to be filled in and explained. A great deal more research was needed, and this was not easy as there were so few direct references to Indians in the history books or archives of the period. And when a name is given, it's often difficult to recognize because of the erratic spelling. We searched every book we could find written about Zanzibar of the period, in German and French, as well as English, and visited archives and libraries in Zanzibar and UK. Gradually, more and more information came to light. Hitherto unknown letters turned up in SOAS, and newspapers turned out to be a rich source of information, particularly the Zanzibar Gazette and the Illustrated London News. Sir John Kirk's papers in the National Library in Edinburgh also turned out to be a fruitful source. The result was the Sultan Spymaster, Pieradugi of Zanzibar. Next, please. There are still gaps in his life where I had to use guesswork, but hopefully it paints a plausible picture of what it was like to be an Ismaili in Zanzibar in the era of the Sultans. The book describes why the Ismailis came to Zanzibar, how they lived and died, sometimes of cholera, prospered and struggled, and then disagreed amongst themselves, causing deep divisions which only now are beginning to heal. How the British Empire helped them and then did not. Pieradugi travelled to England and France. He was Sultan's most trusted friend and advisor. He became so powerful that in a description written by a Frenchman, Colonel Shai Long, he is described as Bargash's alter ego, a well-instructed man who unites in the portfolio of Prime Minister the several departments of state. In a word, he is the state. This short extract came to light after the book was finished. It was further proof of just how influential Piera was during the period before the British and Germans took control. Research is always an ongoing process, and no doubt more information about Piera will emerge. But this is an example of the lengths we went to in our research. The quotation I just gave you comes from an obscure book, The Khedive's Expedition to Zanzibar and the Juba, which was printed in 1887. It is written by a French colonel who commanded an unsuccessful Egyptian invasion of Somalia, which was then part of the territories of Zanzibar, which took place in 1875. His ship ran out of coal and had to put in at Zanzibar to ask for fuel. Pirudugi attended the ship, and it was at his recommendation that the ship was given permission to refuel and return to Egypt. Lucky to escape with his life, the Frenchman had every reason to feel grateful to Pira. After the death of Sultan Bargash in 1888, his successor, Sultan Khalifa, relied on Pira more and more as the political situation disintegrated and war broke out on the German coast, now Tanzania. Pira became embroiled in international politics as the rivalries between Germany and England intensified. He tried to protect the Sultan from a colonial takeover, but could not. In 1889, he was deported to Bombay, but returned within 6 months and was employed by a British company to help reorganize the port and put in a Western-style form of administration. His insider knowledge was invaluable, but working as an employee did not suit Pira. He fell out with his British bosses and returned to the palace, but things were not as they had been. Zanzibar became a British protectorate in 1890, and all senior government posts were in the hands of Englishmen. Instead, Pira's managerial skills were put to use in arranging enormous state ceremonies and lavish banquets, as the sultans compensated for their loss of power with increasingly elaborate outward show. Next slide, please. This is a particularly interesting plate, as it has the Forward Brothers written in Arabic in the center. Pirudugi worked for this company, and in 1892, a modernized free port was opened with much fanfare in Zanzibar. Pirudugi's mark appears on the reverse. Pira comes across as a man of exceptional talents. He was described in contemporary accounts as versatile and omnipotent, a perfect spy whose channels were never clogged. His nature was naturally outgoing and gregarious, and he reached out to other communities and broke down barriers. He was a businessman who managed the Sultan's shipping line and acted as his agent. He had his own import-export business, trading mainly in plates and cloth pieces or kangas. And he set up a company for his sons. He was sincerely devout. He entertained His Highness Aga Khan III, Sultan Muhammad Shah, on his first visit to Zanzibar in 1899, pulled his rickshaw through the narrow streets of the town, and subsequently gave a feast every year to commemorate the visit. Pira was nearly 60 at the time, so pulling the rickshaw was no mean feat. In 1902, he was given the further honor of delivering the tribute of the faithful in Zanzibar to the Aga Khan in London. During the final years of his life, Pira was saddened by the rifts within the Ismaili Zanzibar community, especially when some of his own sons became Ithnashri. His businesses failed to prosper, and he died of a heart attack in 1904 on his way back home from his office. Despite his importance in the history of Zanzibar, in the next decades, the name of Pirudugi was all but forgotten. It was only due to the determination of his great-grandson Hussein that it can now be remembered again. Sadly, Hussein died not long after the book was published. Right, slide, next one, please. This shows His Highness Aga Khan III outside Westminster Abbey in 1902. He was attending King Edward VII's coronation, and the man standing with him is, I believe, one of the first Indian MPs in UK. I'm not sure what his name is, but maybe one of you might. So since writing the Piraduji book, I have moved away from researching the Indian communities directly. But I always enjoy it when inquiries come in, and I like to help whenever I can. I have a card index of historic Mombasa and coastal personalities and add to it whenever new people and information turns up. I also have archival material which I have collected over the years. To end this talk, I thought first of all I might show you a few of the really important early Ismaili pioneers. So next slide, please. This shows the Ismaili merchant Siwa Haji Peru, who, like Pira, came from Kutch. And this large painting turned up in Mombasa in the 1980s. It shows him with his hand on the Quran. He was very devout and charitable and ran a profitable transportation business based in Bagamoyo. Aladina Visram was related to him and came over from India as a young boy to work for him before moving to British East Africa, an even greater business success. Siwa Haji Peru was born in 1851, and he is one of the earliest of the successful merchants to actually be born in Zanzibar. So, and he is an important figure. The next two slides show Taria Topan, who was one of the first Ismailis to come to Zanzibar. He too came originally from Kutch and arrived in Zanzibar aged 12 as a stowaway aboard a dhow in 1835. He helped many of his fellow Ismailis emigrate and find work in East Africa. He had a very successful career, becoming one of the richest and most influential Indian merchants. This slide shows the Sultan of Zanzibar and his entourage on their visit to England in 1875. Taria Topan is standing just behind, in the center, just behind Sultan Bargash. Evidence of just how important he was as one of the Sultan's most trusted advisors. Next. This photograph was taken in the 1880s, and I came across it in the papers of Sir John Kirk, which are held in Edinburgh. It is taken in the British consulate in Zanzibar, and Sir Taria Topan is seated with Mrs. Kirk and her daughter amongst the consular staff. And it shows the great esteem and friendship the British had for Topan. He helped the British persuade the Sultan of Zanzibar to close his slave markets in 1873 and received a knighthood in recognition for his assistance. Sometimes I write short articles for the magazine Old Africa, produced in Kenya, but available online. And the next couple of pictures I'm going to show you bring up two questions that I hope maybe someone in the audience can help me solve. So one article I wrote several years ago was about a dusty old broken bottle which turned up in Mombasa. On the front was written, Al-Arakia Valley, Zanzibar, Mombasa. And in the center was the symbol of a lion carrying a sword. It intrigued me, and I was able to discover that this was the logo of a successful fizzy drink manufacturer and seller whose business began as early as around 1870 in Zanzibar. The bottles were imported from UK, and in fact, this bottle has the mark on the back of W. Barnard and Sons, who was a very prolific bottle manufacturer. The bottles would have been refilled many times, not like the wasteful single use we are accustomed to nowadays. I tried to trace his descendants, but was somewhat defeated due to the confusing Muslim naming system, which calls the son after the father and does not use a set surname. To this day, I am not quite sure whether Al-Arakia Valley was an Ismaili or not, but know that there are Ismaili families who nowadays call themselves Al-Arakia or Valley, who may be related. Perhaps some of you in the audience can shed more light on the family. I would be most interested to hear. It was, in any case, a fascinating exercise to research this humble object and show how it could provide a window onto history and add to knowledge. Another intriguing Ismaili mystery resurfaced recently about 2 stone lions, which were stolen from outside the Jamaat Khana in Parklands, Nairobi in 1909. There is quite a fascinating story behind this incident, as the lions were taken by the son of an American president, Kermit Roosevelt, as a drunken prank while passing the Jamaat Khana on his way back to the house of Northrop Macmillan, where he was staying as a guest. Kermit's father, ex-president Teddy Roosevelt, was visiting Kenya on a high-profile safari, and Kermit, who was then in his early 20s, was accompanying him. The lions were spotted a few days later in Macmillan's sitting room. By this time, the theft had been reported and publicised. Macmillan was advised to get rid of them quickly to avoid embarrassing the Roosevelts or causing a diplomatic scandal. He buried them at his farm at Old Donya Sabuk. But then in 1937, they were dug up when some trees were being removed. 20 years later, the new owners of the farm were mystified by the strange objects they had excavated. All kinds of theories were put forward. Were they ancient objects from an unknown African civilization? They were taken to the British Museum for investigation and displayed there the following year. It seems in UK, someone finally recognized their true identity. But what transpired then remains an unsolved mystery. World War II was imminent and minds were elsewhere. But what happened to the lions? Were they ever returned? I wonder if anyone in this group knows. Researching the Indian communities of East Africa is particularly rewarding, as it is by and large a story of success. Several of the first adventurous Ismaili settlers who left their homes and came to Zanzibar, Kenya and Uganda in the 19th century with barely a penny in their pockets became rich and respected. Their descendants are prospering, some still living in East Africa and others in the wider diaspora. It is a truly heartwarming tale of determination and resilience, and those of you who are descended from those pioneers should feel pride in their achievements. But the history of Ismaili settlement in East Africa still needs more research. Kojawiki in Canada is doing a good job collecting individual stories, and Vali Jamal is active in Uganda, tracing the history of Indian settlement there, while your own Mohammed Khashoggi has written about his South African experience. Perhaps it is time for the Ismaili Institute in UK to build a database, so when a name is put in, the family and the history appears. In that way, you and your children's children will know and not forget the remarkable journey of your ancestors. Research is never ending. I enjoy the process, hunting for information and the buzz when one more small piece falls into place. But be prepared for surprises and to acknowledge mistakes. For many years, scholars believed the world was flat, but then it turned out to be round. Sometimes gaps in knowledge cannot be filled, and it is important to know when to stop and let others follow on. That is rather a philosophical note on which to end. Thank you.